It's time to get sexy on Secular Sexuality.
Hello and welcome to Secular Sexuality, the ACA show where we talk about hearts, parts, and everything in between. Joining me, of course, is Bianca.
Hello, everyone.
And back again is the founder and president of Recovering from Religion, as well as this very show, Dr. Darrel Ray. Darrel, thanks so much for being back with us.
Good to have you. Good to be back, and thanks for having me back on.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll go ahead and thank all of you for joining us and for being here. I'll clue you in that tonight we're going to be talking about circumcision, about the ways to heal, about why as a society we've decided this is important, about whether or not it's important, and about what we're doing with our penises. So if you have any questions about that or anything else that you'd like to speak to Darrel about, if you'd like to call into the show, we'd love to hear from you. We're here at 512-686-0279. That number again is 512-686-0279. We'll be taking calls throughout the show, so we'd love to hear from you. With that, I guess we really have to start with the question of why is this a topic of conversation? Circumcision is incredibly prevalent in America. I mean, it's more than 80% of American males, and everybody seems to just kind of go along with it. So is there even a problem here? What is it that we're doing tonight?
Well, there's a lot of big problems, not least of which it's a medically unnecessary procedure. And so there's no reason for it, no medical reason for it. Rarely is there a medical reason for it. So to actually practice this, you've got to look at some of the history. And I'd love to go into a little bit of the history before we start taking any phone calls. Would that be okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, if you go back and literally thousands of years, over the course of history, lots of different cultures practice some kind of circumcision of males and sometimes of females too. More common the males, though, throughout history. But every culture had a different angle on the cut, I guess you could say.
Yikes. So I guess a vague warning to listeners. There's maybe a lot of like leg crossing and uncrossing for some of the penis havers in the audience tonight. Yeah. We are going to be talking about clipping, snipping, and dehooding. I mean, I'm sure that most of our audience is probably aware or familiar or thinks of circumcision in terms of America's Christian past or just of the Christian influence on Europe, and we tie that back into Judaism and Abraham's covenant with God. But I guess what you're saying is that circumcision is hardly specific to Judaism and then Christianity after it.
No, lots of different cultures, even in that day, practiced some kind of circumcision, and it is not identical to what Judaism practiced. However, as Judaism set the standard, so to speak, for what we know of as circumcision.
What an honorific.
Right. But the Christians did not circumcise. Christians today, most Christians on this planet do not circumcise unless they live in the United States. It is an aberration of United States culture. It goes back to about the 1880s when a man that you're very familiar with his name, Kellogg, Mr. Dr. Kellogg, he was actually a medical doctor. He was a very religious medical doctor who was very concerned about boys masturbating and girls being lascivious, uncontrolled sexual creatures. So he came up with, first of all, he came up with a cereal that would help boys control their masturbation. And that's the cereal we eat today, or at least a version of it today. I'm sure it was quite different. It was actually quite bland when he first, he thought spicy meals increased, or that kind of thing increased people's desire to masturbate.
Yeah,
this was a man.
Breaking news, it's still very bland. But also,
still not pleasant to eat.
I love this idea that, here we are, not necessarily with the goal of spicing up people's sex life, but we use that kind of terminology and to think of the opposite, this idea that by eating like bland milquetoast foods all day would somehow take away our sexual urges.
Well, isn't that the same reason that the graham cracker was invented?
Yeah, I've heard that as well.
Yeah, and now it's
Yeah,
something you
yeah.
put s'mores between, and whoever invented that's
And
rolling over in his
are
grave.
hooking up in tents
Yeah,
and
right.
camping. I don't know. Maybe that's just me. Personally, I think tent sex is like in the
Take back
top
Kellogg's
five.
Flakes.
But you know, we're getting far afield. I don't mean to interrupt you, Darrel.
Well, so Kellogg, among others, but he was the leader in this. He was a medical doctor who married very late in life and never had, as far as we know, never had sex. It appears he never even masturbated. We don't know. Of course, he probably lied about that, as most men do. But he was very concerned about everybody else's sex life. He never had children. He had a very unhappy marriage, for what we can tell, and probably for obvious reasons. But he was the one that created this notion that circumcision reduced boys' desire for sex and especially need to masturbate. And so he started encouraging, practicing, teaching these ideas back in the 1880s, 1890s. Now, keep in mind, the only people who were circumcising in the United States were Jews at that time. And then within 40 years, by 1929 or 30, actually a little more than 40 years, but by 1929 or 30, something like 70% of the children born in hospitals were being circumcised. That's a rapid change in a practice, just phenomenal practice. But it's rooted in his deeply, I believe he was a Millerite, I believe, which is related to the Seventh-day Adventists, if I recall, I can't remember which is Seventh-day Adventist or the Church of Christ Scientists. I can't remember which one it was. You can look it up. Just Google it. There's all the stuff I'm talking about is on his Wikipedia page.
Oh my gosh,
So
it's so weird to imagine something that kind of insane taken off in 40 years when we're told to like wait for the tide to change for things like gay rights or trans rights. It's like, oh, it'll take time. Like, no, things don't. They started circumcising children within the space of 40 years, and 70% of people.
I mean, just imagine that something as innocuous or harmless, the elective surgery or what have you, of piercing your ears. Mm-hmm. If we somehow were to associate that with our sexuality and go from, nearly no men or mostly no men not piercing their ears to suddenly within 40 years it being at least 3 out of 4.
Right.
I mean, that's really remarkable. And again, I'm talking about ears, not penises.
Yeah.
So... Which I don't mean to particularly stigmatize that organ, but I feel like for very obvious reasons it's super relevant.
Yeah. Well, the fact is that it was a meme. I mean, if you think about it in terms of memetics, it was a meme that covered the United States in a very short period of time. 40 years not being for that long for this kind of a practice. But so by like 1929 or 30, we've got this huge change, and it's deeply, deeply related to fundamentalist Christian ideas about sex and sexuality, and about boys controlling themselves and not masturbating. It also, have you heard anything like, we've heard about the no fapping movement now?
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
Well, it's just a reiteration of that same kind of scare tactics around male sexuality. Mm-hmm. But here's the other piece of this. You can go Google all this, but one of the other pieces is he thought it was just as important to do bad things to little girls too. And so he would actually do clitoridectomies or do other things that would reduce the pleasure that women would have when they became adults. And this was not, it never took off like it did for boys, but it was common, far more common than we think. We think about female genital mutilation as a Muslim thing. Mm-hmm. No, it's not just a Muslim thing. There's other cultures that do it besides Muslims, and Christians were doing it right here in the United States in the 1890s and up to about 1920 or so. It never took off. However, in 2001, in my practice, I met a woman that was born in 1930s, plus or minus. So she was about 70 years old when she came into my practice, dealing with some other issues not related. But in the course of our work together, I learned that she had had a clitoridectomy when she was a young girl. Her mother had taken her to a doctor, and the doctor had prescribed it. Now, this girl was old enough to remember this. This was happening right here in the United States, and this would have been in the 1930s. Now, let me go one step further. My father was born in 1928. My grandmother, who was a flapper and quite a floozy and quite libertine for a while. In fact, we just recently learned that she and my grandfather were living together for 11 years before they got married. In fact, we don't even
that
have
explains a lot about your career, sir. I feel like I'm learning so much right now.
Well, I can tell you a lot about my family's really interesting in bad ways in some ways. But my grandmother finally got infected with fundamentalist religion about 1940 or 41. And at the age of 12, took my father in to the doctor and had him circumcised. At the age of 12, my father did not consent to this. It was incredibly traumatic, incredibly painful. Evidently, there was no anesthesia from what he described to me. And it scarred my father for the rest of his life. I could see it till practically the day he died, how much it affected him. But of course, most of us, I was circumcised. Most people go through the circumcision when they're, a few days old. Mm-hmm. We don't have a neurological memory of it, but we probably have got. It had effect on our bodies that we may or may not recognize. Mm. So this goes back a ways. It's currently being practiced today, and it's only been very recently, and I think it's within the last 5 or 6 years, the American Pediatric Association would not come out against it. And only recently has the American Pediatric Association come out saying it's not a medically necessary procedure and is not recommended any longer. But that's just really recently. And it's insidious that the medical profession has gone along with this crazy idea.
So were they saying it was a necessary medical operation up until then?
They would never. They were always kind of silent. They wouldn't say one way or the other. But it's only been recently that they have finally come out and said it is not a medical necessity. Now, there's a difference between coming out saying it's not a necessity and just being silent about it.
Right.
They didn't want to piss off, religious people and parents. But now we have there's several problems that are happening as a direct result of this. And that is people are learning that it's not medically necessary. And then, I realize I have been having problems sexually, maybe. And I find out that it might be related to my circumcision. Well, why am I having this problem? It's because the doctor who did the circumcision 30 years ago, 40 years ago, whatever, didn't know what the fuck they were doing. Mm-hmm. I mean, think about it. There's no training course in medical school on how to do circumcision. And the doctor who's being trained, who's doing it, is often the least experienced doctor in the hospital. And if you're Jewish, it's not even a doctor. It's a mohel that's doing it and giving you herpes or whatever. So there's consequences to this that have been extant in this culture for 100 years, and nobody's looked at it. Until recently, there's not even any books on it. A guy named Lindsay Watson wrote a book about 10 years ago called Unspeakable Mutilations, and he documented how much malpractice, how much mutilation of men's genitals is happening by the medical profession in a wide range of countries, not just the United States, but also in Australia, in Indonesia, in the Muslim world. Some Muslim subcultures circumcise boys and girls, as we know. Mm-hmm. But the people doing it are not medically very well trained. And since it's not necessary, and you're dealing with a teeny tiny penis that's smaller than my little finger, and you're trying to do an operation on it with somebody that's not properly trained. and nobody really knows, how much, quote, how much do you cut off? It's arbitrary. There's no standards. Circumcision is a crapshoot, and maybe as many as 1 in 10 men have a circumcision that too much was taken off, so it's causing them pain in sex. They get an erection, they have pain. There's a lot of consequences to this. Nature made us like we are, and a lot of other animals have penises that look similar to ours and have extra skin, that we have as well. So there's a reason for that, and there's what happened was after it got invented or after it got spread, then you have to invent a reason for it, because you can't just say, I'm doing it because my religion told me to, because Paul said in the New Testament it's not necessary. So it's not necessary for Christians to get circumcised according to their own Bible. So why are they doing it? What they've done is gone back and retroactively said, well, it's a health thing, it's a cleanliness thing. Yep. No, men can't keep themselves clean. Well, that's totally bullshit, of course. And now women have bought into that, and mothers bought into that. Well, I want my baby to be clean. And now women of dating age have bought into it. Well, I don't want to date a man who's not circumcised because that means he's unclean. I don't want to, it's all this bullshit. And then just being in a locker room among other penis havers, the discomfort of being different. There was specifically one person. I went to a very small high school, I should mention, but there was specifically two people who were not circumcised. And there may have been more, but I can tell you that there were two because everybody knew. The people who were showering with them knew, but the people who weren't showering with them, all the women knew, everybody knew that these particular two guys weren't circumcised. And there was a lot of social stigma and shame attached to all of that.
Yeah.
Right. And there are online dating sites that actually ask if you're circumcised or not. And women will, they're able to say, no, I don't want to date you because you're circumcised. Right. There's so much wrong. Sorry, Dee, what'd you say?
I said as if dating sites weren't awful and embarrassing enough. No.
I wouldn't know anything about those.
Right, clearly. Well, there's a lot there that I'd like to tackle, and a bunch of different things that I wanted to make sure to bring up. Where to even start? I think one in particular is just to mention that that it is very different in America versus Europe, that there is this social stigma that comes attached to circumcision. And I guess my question to you is, what would you say to a mother who's, worried about that part of the process, about their son being the only person, at least 80 or 90% of men are circumcised. So how do you avoid that stigma, and how do you respond to that?
Well, I would say if you get your son circumcised, you're cutting off about 80% of the nerve endings that give him pleasure. Mm-hmm. Do you really want your son growing up to be an adult and learning that you reduced his pleasure for no fucking reason on the planet except social? You don't want to get stigmatized. There are a lot of women that will date somebody who is not circumcised. It's just that why... There are a lot that are now being programmed. We are programming teenage girls to think that uncircumcised boys are unclean. Mm-hmm. It's a part of our sex education. We need to be talking out loud about this. Hell no, he's going to have a lot more fun with his penis when he's not circumcised.
Also, it's more pleasurable for the other person as well, because the way it ends up being is like you don't need as much lube, you don't need it's more pleasurable for your partner as well.
Right.
Yeah, which is remarkable to me. You mentioned, Darrel, of course, that it's natural, which is, obvious in the sense that that's the way you're naturally born. And we can get into some of the evolutionary theories of why that is and the different components of that. There is plenty of reason to believe that that a penis has that extra skin to pull out the semen of other men in a internal mate competition sort of situation. So there's a lot of understanding of why this is. But I guess what is so baffling to me is that we would start from this idea of God made our bodies and somehow we still need to change it. But then, as you said, kind of retroactively coming up with an excuse. And I have to tell you, in preparing for this episode, I also wrote an article about circumcision for the ACA newsletter back in January. And in doing all of my research for that, I found that it was remarkably difficult to find good information about these conversations. There's so much out there that is really misleading. There's a lot of equivocating. You mentioned that the American Pediatric Association has been very, very slow to take any kind of meaningful stance. And even that stance has been severely couched. There are a lot of critics on both sides. And frankly, a simple Google search will not get you to where you need to go. You will find plenty of misinformation both directions.
Well, I don't know what misinformation there is around just leaving intact. I belong to a group called I'm an intactivist, if you will. There's a group, there's a whole movement called intactivism, and it's people literally all over the planet. It started, I believe, in Australia, but it's basically trying to say, don't,
a very separate conversation. There are these kind of very difficult studies that I find are sometimes like pulled up that say that circumcision reduces rates of transference of HIV and these other things. When you scratch the surface and actually dig into those, myself not as a researcher, as a doctor, I find them to be very thin and flimsy. But you do see that kind of thing floated around. You also see all of these arguments about how babies don't remember it, about how they don't need anesthesia because their nervous system isn't developed enough. Then you find other people saying that they don't need anesthesia because they're in shock because we're causing such incredible trauma. And frankly, as somebody who knows a little something about a penis, I found myself really baffled in digging into the literature on these things. And so I think it's remarkably telling that no one is able to really just go online and find good information. That to me suggests not some broad conspiracy necessarily, but a lot of very important ideas that people don't want to look at too closely, because then they'd have to really deal with the fact that they are circumcised themselves, that their children are circumcised, that, the doctors, the researchers publishing these studies don't necessarily want to know the truth of what's going on or what they're doing.
Well, I think there's a lot of cognitive dissonance. What if you're the doctor and you've circumcised, 1,000 kids in your career?
Yeah.
And now you look back and say, fuck, I've hurt 1,000 people. There's a lot of dissonance there, and you don't want to have to face your own mirror. Look, you're in the mirror. Women, I get women literally coming up to me after my talks and saying, I feel so guilty because I got my son circumcised. And I mean, they're just racked with guilt about this. And all I can say is, look, you did the best you could with what you knew at the time, and you relied upon the medical profession. The medical profession is at fault. They should have enough sense to look at the evidence here and make reasonable recommendations. I could go on and on. I'm pretty passionate about this.
I think a large part of this is also the concept that if a child is under a certain age, they don't have the same rights as an older person. Because I think a lot of this ties into the problems faced by intersex people in the intersex community.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it's the same thing. Oh, you're born and you don't look like how we think you should look. We are going to take it upon ourselves to then decide what your sex is going to be and then assign you that sex after we perform the surgery on you as an infant that cannot give consent. That's terrifying, and that certainly does have very far-reaching effects. I've watched documentaries about people who are like, I'm not, like, now I have to go through the entire, like, transition process and deal with that because some doctor 18, 20 years ago made that decision for me.
Arbitrarily decided that I was a man or that I was a woman and decided to just chop.
Yep.
Right. So I think V, you're right on target with that one, because what you're talking about is bodily autonomy.
Right.
And does an infant have autonomy? And I think, legally speaking, they should, and our culture should be legally protecting infants, whether they're intersexed or males or females. We're not even protecting female genital mutilation very well in the United States. It is happening.
Oh, a law just recently got struck down that now makes it easier for certain states to do it, which is horrifying.
Yeah, it is. So the question is, does religion trump, I hate that word these days.
Right. In this case, it's apt.
Does it supersede or trump whatever body autonomy an infant should have? I think parents should have the responsibility, not the right. There's a big difference. They should have the responsibility to do the medically important things to allow an infant to become an adult. To raise that child. Mm-hmm. They have a responsibility there. I do not think parents should have the right to interfere with the body of an infant that is not medically necessary.
Yeah.
Right.
And I realize the notion of medical necessity is evolving and changing. I'm not saying that can't change, but in this case, we know this is not medically necessary.
Right.
And in 1970, when Dr. Money, I believe it was, did this horrible experiment with an intersex child, we can argue he knew no better, but we do know better now, and we shouldn't be doing any of that shit. Bodily autonomy. When in doubt, don't mess with the body. Just leave it alone, and let that person grow up and decide what they want to do. So, all right. Darrel's rant for the day. Thanks for letting me rant.
You mentioned the loss of sensation. And I think we all understand that when you are basically cutting on a piece of your body, that you're going to be affecting the nerve endings. I walk us through a little bit what is either the accepted or the disputed understanding of what this procedure actually does.
Well, there's no doubt you're cutting something off, and we know that there are nerve endings going into that. I mean, the interesting thing is the penis is just, the default in most mammals and in humans especially is female. So if testosterone is never introduced to this infant as it grows up, it will become female, even if it's got an X and a Y chromosome. It's the hormones that give the signal. What are you? Are you a male or are you a female? So that's an important component here. And if you look at just the clitoris, and we've only learned this in the last 10 years, you would think we'd know more about the clitoris than we do.
I mean, frankly, nobody's been interested.
Yeah.
If we're being frank, I mean, our priorities. I think it's remarkable and great that we can perform transplants of all these different organs and things, but our sexual organs are seen as superficial, as insignificant or unimportant. And
right.
As we talk about what a large percentage of Americans specifically are circumcised, I can't help but point out just how sexual neuroses is one of our greatest exports. I mean, when you compare our films, our literature to the rest of the world, I mean, just frankly, looking at a copy of Cosmo magazine versus UK Cosmo, there are dramatic differences there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, true. Well, the reason I bring up the clitoris is because we now know that it's much larger, gigantic, compared to just the little nub that many women would think of as their clitoris. And it goes clear back deep into the, vaginal tract, which we now know. We used to call it the G spot. We just know now it's just an extension of the clitoris.
So there's no excuse not to find it. It's gigantic.
Well, no, there's actually some really cool interest. This is a little bit of a deviation here, but I'm a deviant, so that wouldn't matter. Going clear back to the 1920s, unfortunately, there was a female doctor that did some amazing research on women's sexual organs, and she pretty much discovered some interesting things, that women could have orgasms Women whose clitoris is closer to the vaginal opening, and I wish I could remember the name of the doctor. I'm not remembering right now. The closer the clitoris is to the vaginal opening, the easier it was for the woman to have an orgasm. And I will just say from personal experience, I think her research was accurate. But we'll move on beyond that. The farther it is, the harder it is for the woman to have an orgasm. And she discovered this like in 1921. She had interviewed and as a medical doctor, had done lots of examinations of lots of women. And she seemed to be all right on track until she hooked up with Carl Jung. I believe it was Carl Jung or Freud. I don't remember which one of the two. And they basically convinced her that women don't have orgasms. So they go,
Oh my
you're
God.
a woman. You're a woman. You've examined all these women. And she totally backtracked, didn't try to get her. She did get some of her work published. But, of course, back then, that was a little bit on the taboo side. But the research
publishing
was
a
there.
lady doctor's research on the clitoris? I mean,
Yeah.
who would read such a
Calm
thing?
down, people.
So we know, I mean, it's kind of an interesting side note that this massive amount of nerve endings is in the clitoris. Why would we not think we have a massive number of nerve endings in the head of the penis? And we do. When you look at it, where are the nerve endings going? They're going throughout, throughout the skin, no matter foreskin or whatever. And you cut it off, you're cutting off nerve endings. Now, of course, I'm circumcised, so I will never know. I will never know if it's better or not. But there are men out there who have had both. And they can say, without a shadow of a doubt in their mind, they got circumcised. They were not circumcised, then they got circumcised. Right now in Africa, the fake science around HIV infection has had men standing in line to get circumcised by government agencies and by doctors who are almost always Christian, saying, "Well, we're gonna stop the infection by circumcision." There is almost no evidence, and even if there is evidence, it's so tiny, so infinitesimal that it's not worth looking at. Start wearing condoms. That'd do a lot more.
That'd do a whole lot more.
Right? If only Christians pushed that.
They'd rather cut your dick than tell you to wear a condom. That's really what's going on.
Yep.
It's basically religious again.
Yeah, that's a devastating thought. Well, okay, so you mentioned the intactivist movement, and I guess I wanted to ask you, there are a number of questionable products and services and things that you're seeing online that enable men to regrow or to, I guess, heal from a circumcision. And I'm curious if there's any validity to these, if there's something I've missed, because everything I've seen has been, at best, very concerning.
Well, I can't say of any personal experience. I've not used them, but I have talked to men who have. Mm-hmm. And here's the bottom line. I think just like if you take your earlobe and you pull on it constantly with a heavy earring, it's going to get longer.
Sure.
Well, there's no doubt you can do the same thing to the foreskin. If there's enough foreskin there to get a hold of, so to speak, there are instruments that will get a hold of it and pull on it. And there's no doubt you can extend what foreskin you have. Now, you'd have to have some, or if the doctor cut it off too much, then you might not have much to work with. But that does not necessarily mean the nerve endings grow back.
Right.
And certainly not the number of nerve endings there. So I don't know. I think there's there's mixed results. I think there's at least one good instrument out there that seems to do a decent job of extending the foreskin. But who knows if it's actually improving the nerve endings or the feeling of pleasure. Mm-hmm. Now, like V said earlier, it probably does assist in intercourse because it's there. You're right, V. You require less lubricant if you are circumcised or uncircumcised, I mean. So that part may be helped a little bit. But I'm not going to advise anybody to go out and buy these things. I don't think it will hurt. I don't think it hurts anything. I'm not sure it really helps that much. Sure. But if it makes a guy feel better, and if he does have a difference in sensation, I can't see a harm in it. Do you see harm, or are you hearing anything bad?
I honestly, I haven't heard of any like botched regrowth experiences or anything problematic. I think the biggest concern would just be kind of giving into a false hope or something along those lines, which, again, I don't want to rule these things out. I'm certainly not saying that none of them are effective or meaningful, just that I haven't been impressed and I haven't seen any reason to believe that they are effective. But as you mentioned, even if we call it a placebo, if it does help to regrow some foreskin, and even if it doesn't necessarily change your sensation or your sexual experience, if it changes your sense of identity or your personal experience, that in and of itself can be meaningful. But it also begs the question, what else should men be doing or penis havers be doing who are struggling with a sense of lost identity, who are struggling with maybe the trauma of these initial experiences and are wanting to heal, emotionally and psychologically from this experience?
Well, I think that's an important question, because there are men out there that have discovered at whatever adult age they are that this is done to them. And now they feel very betrayed by their parents for having done it in the first place. And I've seen a number of examples where it has now disrupted their relationship with their parents. And I don't think that the parents obviously did the best they could. But now the adult child's looking back and saying, man, you fucked me over bad. I'm having trouble with my sexual relationships or whatever. And they're having a hard time forgiving their parents. And I think
there have been some high-profile cases of men suing their mothers and these different things. And, our legal system is very complex. I think that's more about awareness than it is about retribution per se. But certainly this is a thing that exists in the zeitgeist of our culture. Right. People are starting to struggle to come to terms with these things.
Right. Well, I think another thing to think about, and I don't have a solution for this necessarily, but if a man, and we are talking about male people who own penises right now mainly, is having difficulty, they have pain while having intercourse, or they have pain while masturbating, or some other consequences happening, they should probably get a medical examination and find out. If the doctor says, yeah, you don't have enough foreskin to be masturbating, or you're probably getting pain because of a botched circumcision, then there's probably there may be medical remedies, I don't know. But sometimes men go through life feeling ashamed because they can't perform. Well, why are they not performing? It may be because they had a botched circumcision. And if they can get some medical assistance, or at least know the source of it, maybe they can find workarounds. And I think there's a lot of men out there who are suffering unnecessarily. They don't know what the problem is, and they're ashamed to talk to their doctor about it. Mm-hmm. And I would go to a doctor who's competent and, understands that circumcision is not a necessary procedure and it can be botched. Right. Maybe 10%, up to 10% of men have had too much foreskin chopped off. Well, that means you got trouble the rest of your life, unless you get some remediation. So whatever that could be.
Do you think that, maybe I have an overblown sense of how accepted this concept is because my bubble is very specific. But I feel like the concept of bottom surgery in general and the idea that you can have surgical options down there, gasp, is kind of being sort of normalized a little bit by the conversation happening around trans people. Do you think that this could potentially offer a solution to these people who are trying to recover from that?
Well, that's a great idea, V. And I'll just say right off the bat, I hadn't thought of that before. That's a very good idea. And maybe I'm not a medical professional. I'm a psychologist. I deal with the other side of the body, generally speaking. So I don't know, but that'd be kind of interesting to hear what there's a limited number of surgeons that are competent to do bottom surgery. Mm-hmm. But the skills that they're using there, I would think could have some transference to this. That's an interesting idea. I hadn't put those together.
Yeah, well, I mean,
good idea.
Certainly, modern urology has been heavily informed by advances in working with vaginoplasty. I mean, we didn't really see it as a specialty really until after Lily Elb and her surgery back in the early 1900s and these different things. So I think it's a really interesting idea. But I guess what I'm curious about is you said that some as much as like 10% of men have too much foreskin removed. And so if we are all kind of on the same page about, any foreskin being too much, what is that 10% looking like, and what are some of the consequences of that? How would somebody watching this know that, hey, maybe this is something that I should talk to a doctor about?
Well, if you get a full erection and you have pain because the skin is stretched too thin, that's probably a direct result of the foreskin being removed. Now, there are some conditions that the infants have, infant penis owners, that might cause that have nothing to do with circumcision. And sometimes, if that is spotted as an infant, the surgeon or the doctor might cut that. I forget the name of the condition. It's not very common, but it's common enough. It happens often enough. People need to know about it. However, it's even that the current medical thinking, according to what I've seen, is don't even mess with that. Leave it alone, because sometimes the babies outgrow it. There's a lot of things that our bodies can adjust and kind of self-repair. So some of the advice, the old advice was, let's go ahead and cut that so the boy doesn't have problems. Well, that can cause problems alone. So yeah. So I don't know the full answer to that question, but I think I kind of lost my train of thought there, Christy.
Well, in trying to address these concerns, you mentioned, making sure you go to a doctor who understands that this is not a necessary medical procedure and these different things. What is the Secular Therapist Project for going to a urologist or going to a general practitioner? I mean, how do you find a doctor that you think has the ability to understand or at least start you on the process towards appropriate healing?
Yeah, wow. That's that idea has actually occurred to us over the last 10 years, that there should be a secular medical registry as well.
Which I hate to even think of. Like, I hate that we're at this point where we have like a shepherd's guide for atheists, where we have this idea that in order to go to a medical professional with a doctorate degree who doesn't believe in magic is something that maybe we could make an industry out of. But my complaining aside, I don't know if are there maybe some red flags people should be aware of, or anything that you might go into speaking to a professional to get an idea of whether they're competent and capable in these areas?
I don't have a good answer. I'd say if they've got a cross on their in their office, that might be a warning sign.
Do you know if Planned Parenthood has any options for that? I have no idea where they stand on this particular issue. It might be a good starting place.
Yeah, I'm not aware of them having any direct connection to these sorts of issues, but I will say that your local Planned Parenthood, as V has pointed out in the past, can be a great phone call when you're trying to figure out some of these basics. And I imagine that you're talking to, largely informed sex-positive professionals in your area who might be able to tell you about XYZ urologist or whoever who they've had good experiences with.
Yeah.
Well, there is a community that's ahead of us on this, and you guys are probably aware of it, but there is a kink-friendly and poly-friendly medical registry, I guess you could say.
Yeah, the kink-aware professionals list.
Yeah. So if you look there, those people are probably more aware than the average bear in the medical community. I went to a urologist years ago, and and he's asking me about sexual stuff, and I'm just, me, I'm yeah. Here's my 3 girlfriends, and we're all testing all this, and his mouth drops open, and he gets red in the face, and it's like the interview stopped right there. He could not, he just couldn't deal with that. Well, that was my first and last encounter with him. So some doctors just can't talk about it. It's too embarrassing for them, I guess. And a urologist, I mean, golly.
Yeah, somebody who should be well informed and well capable. And, with respect to you, sir, I recognize that the struggles that you and I have in interacting with professionals in these circumstances are minimal compared to a woman who's going into a gynecologist who herself might be suffering from a lot of religious shame and a lot of shyness and, doesn't have the word sex on their business card, who then is having to have these conversations and who may be suffering medically or missing out on all sorts of different opportunities for their well-being.
Right. No, I think women have been much, much worse from the day a girl first goes to any medical doctor around gynecological issues. They're having to deal with their sexuality right up front. And the damn doctors aren't necessarily very well trained to make the girl feel comfortable with her own body. And so shame can happen right in the medical office. Now, I fully understand all that. And you're right. We don't have to go through. Fact is, I really never had anybody talk to me about my sexuality or about my penis or anything until I went to that urologist. And I was probably 50 years old when that happened. So 50 years, and I never had to deal with it once with a medical doctor. Whereas girls have to deal with it literally the minute they become conscious of anybody looking at their bodies medically. So big difference there. I understand. Oh gosh, so where does that leave us?
Yeah, what are some of the solutions? I mean, I know we've talked about how healing physically, there are incredible limitations. We've talked a little bit about some of the psychological trauma and maybe some of the solutions there, but as a society, what ought we be doing? I mean, who do we need to be calling? Who do we need to be voting for? Like, what are some of the solutions here?
Yeah, what are intactivists doing, if anything, besides just raising awareness? Are there things we can join? Are there protests in the streets?
There are actual groups you can join. They're famous for going out in like white clothing, white pants, white shirts, with a big red blotch of blood around their crotch. It was or red paint, I don't know, with signs, says in front of hospitals. Because what you're doing is you're trying to shame. I mean, shame can work sometimes. Shame doctors into not doing this procedure anymore, and at least talking to the parents and saying this is not medically not necessary. And do you want your child growing up knowing you made the decision to cut off part of their body?
Right.
I think that's a reasonable thing for a doctor to ask. Now, maybe the doctor can't legally stop them from asking for a circumcision, but that doctor does not have to do it. They can say, I will not do it. So I think if you have doctors saying, you got doctors doing the other things, I will not do an abortion. Well, why can't you say, I will not do a circumcision?
Well, that would be an interesting result of some of these new religious freedom bills in relation to medical practices. It would make that legal to be able to say this goes against my, moral standing to do this. I won't do it.
Right. Well, doctors have that right now. There's no prohibition. Doctor can say, I don't do that. I won't do that. I've stopped doing that. Any of those things, just a procedure you don't do anymore. But you can enter a conversation. Now, many doctors I know are kind of socially awkward around sexuality. So getting them to talk to a mother and a father about this might be difficult, but they can at least say, I don't do that.
Yeah.
I wish they would go the next step and say, I don't do it, and here is why I don't do it. It's not medically necessary. And I frankly don't want to think about men growing up and not being able to function sexually as adults. And I don't, if they just said that much, I think most parents would say, well, hell no, I'm not getting circumcised, or I'm not getting my kids circumcised. So I think awareness, I don't know how, I don't know where the voting is going to help anything. Here, I think is a direct challenge to the medical community.
Mhm.
Let's be honest. You guys out there, guys and men and women in the medical world, know this is not medically necessary. And we know that they're botched. And the best person is probably still botching a few of them. Why are you even doing something that has a 1% chance of being botched when it's not necessary to begin with? It's pretty simple. It is actually that simple. It's not this complicated. It's complicated because our culture has made it complicated.
Yeah.
Not because there's any complication around this, medically speaking.
Right. Just like so many things, right? It's not actually complicated.
Right.
We're just making it that way.
Right. You go to the Netherlands and tell them what we do, and they look at you like, you guys really are idiots in the United States.
Are you okay?
I mean, that was so shocking to me to do my initial research on this topic and to recognize that in Europe it is only 20%. That confounded me because, as I said, I could count on my hands the number of men that I went to high school with who were not circumcised. And
Right.
So I think it's very frustrating that we are in a situation where the people who we're meant to be able to rely on, the World Health Organization, the American Medical Association, these people that we look to have been so hesitant and so resistant to come out and say very clearly that this is ridiculous, that they are facilitating and furthering this cause. And even if they've sort of let their foot off the gas a little bit, there's an incredible amount of momentum and nobody really slamming on the brakes right now.
Yeah.
Well, I think there is slamming on the brakes. We are seeing the most recent statistics I've seen shows there's been a dramatic decrease. I mean, we are down to, like, last I read, around 50% of infants born in the last 4 or 5 years are not being circumcised, male. So that's a dramatic drop in just a few years. And as you noted earlier, it only took 40 years to get there. Well, if we can go down, 50% or close to it in only the last 5 or 10 years, that's pretty positive.
Yeah.
But there's a lot more.
Well, just to say, I feel like there's a really meaningful tipping point there because I think one of the biggest, oh boy, very hard to avoid the puns on this episode. I think that one of the reasons that circumcisions continue really is that stigma of not wanting your child to be the only one who isn't circumcised. And so if we are getting to a point where it's close to 50%, I would have to imagine within a generation that would dramatically shift to, next to zero.
Yeah.
I would like to hope so. The part of me that's a sex therapist that I guess makes a living off of people's struggles sexually with these types of issues is concerned, but the human part of me is really excited to hear that that's maybe a possibility.
Well, also, isn't one of the main reasons cited is like the dad's like, I want him to look like me. So
which is so strange.
It's just the weirdest rationalization, I feel like.
Because, how often are, like, fathers and sons taking their dicks out to compare?
Who will know
That's
this
so
thing?
baffling.
But if it is indeed down to 50%, then... again, in a generation, that won't be a concern either.
Well, and I think, as Darrel said, there is that cognitive dissonance of if I don't circumcise my child because I think that it's wrong, because I think that it's harmful, because I think that it will negatively affect their life, then I have to come face to face with the fact that I was circumcised and my life was affected and my life was potentially harmed. And particularly in our, macho-leaning culture, no man really wants to deal with the fact that their sexuality, their sexual potency, their sexual experience has been anything other than stellar.
Right? I think that goes for all of us, really.
Yeah.
Also, the fact that many of the people doing circumcisions are doing it for reasons related to religion is also a thing, because a lot of those people I know in my family, I didn't get the talk until I was like 12 or 13, you know? So like the idea of even your child having sex or experiencing sexual pleasure is like taboo. So like making the argument to these people that, oh, well, sex is going to be great for them later.
Someday Timmy's going to grow up and you're going to want him to have just like raging hard-ons and so incredible unlubricated orgasms.
My little brother's name is Timmy.
Okay,
so let's continue this conversation with another name. But I think that's the thing. How do we make this case to people, understanding that we're not going to be deconverting them from their religious belief in order to institute it? What kind of arguments can we make to people that don't hinge necessarily on, well, he's going to have great sex later?
Yeah. Well, I don't mean to harp on it, but I still feel like there's so much pushback saying it's not that big of a deal. I mean, if so many men experience it, how important could it really be? Yeah. Which is, to me, it really is the wrong question if you look at it logically. I mean, if you are going to mutilate somebody's body, the burden of proof kind of should fall on you to prove why it's necessary.
Yeah, that's true.
But even engaging with that conversation, I think that we can say that there are meaningful differences. And I wish that there was more research on these topics. I think that as big data becomes more accessible, we're going to start to see significant cultural differences in the sexual experiences of people in different nations. And we're going to be able to connect that to circumcision rates. So I mean, it's hard to say right now when, again, the vast majority of men in this country are being circumcised or are circumcised, but there's a lot of reasons to hope that within the next generation or so that'll turn around.
Yeah, I think there is, but it's not going to change all by itself, and it could go backwards. We could see that in our political climate with all the crazy religious stuff. The interesting thing is, as I said earlier, they're very Bible. The Christian Bible says circumcision is not necessary.
Don't ask Christians to read the Bible. That's ridiculous. That'll make them stop being Christians. If they had read the Bible, they wouldn't be Christians. So
that's pretty true. Pretty true. All right. Well, anyway,
but
I've got through my outline here. I've got other things I'd like to talk about tonight, but
well, I wanted to make sure to give an opportunity for you to mention any other resources, any other materials, a book you'd like to recommend, or anything along those lines.
Yeah, go get Lindsay Watson's book called Unspeakable Mutilations.
And I checked that out on Amazon today. It's $3 for the Kindle edition, so it's readily available for everybody out there.
Actually, if you're a Prime, I saw today, if you're a Prime member, it's free. On Kindle. Yeah, so get it Amazon. And look at it. But it's got two components to it. It talks about the medical side of it and the history side of it, of course. But the more important side is to read men's stories. He's got story after story after story. He interviewed men from a wide number of countries, because we're not the only place doing this. From Indonesia, from Malaysia, from a lot of Islamic countries, as well as Christian countries. And he's documented how many, I mean, it's not a statistical sample, so I'm not saying he's statistically done that kind of research, but he's showing how, just as we know it deeply affects women when you have female circumcision, it also deeply affects men when you have male circumcision, especially when it's botched. And there's a so anyway, that's bottom line. Get the book, look at it, look at the research, go visit the Intactivism websites. I can't remember, intactivism.com or something like that is the main one, and look at, you know, they're really radical. They're standing in front of hospitals with signs to say, don't cut your boy's dick. You know, it's pretty radical.
Hey, well, Christians do it at abortion clinics. We can adopt the
Yeah.
same tactics for actually good reasons.
Yeah,
Yeah,
seriously.
right.
Speaking of religious trauma, Darrel, you said you had something coming up soon.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah, thanks for asking me about that, V. About a I don't know, almost a year ago, a woman named Janice Selby, a therapist from Vancouver, British Columbia, came up with this notion of let's put the notion of religious trauma on the map. And we know PTSD is a real thing. We know how to treat it. We know the symptoms. We have learned a lot in the last 10 or 15 years about PTSD. And my good friend Hector Garcia, which I think you guys know Hector.
Yeah, he was on the show back in February.
Yeah.
Right. Hector is probably one of the world's expert, if not the world's expert in some of this stuff. So what I'm saying is we know a lot about trauma. We know a lot what it causes. We know what the symptoms are. And about, let me go back another 10 years. A Dr. Marlene Winnell, a woman, a psychologist out of the Bay Area, who herself had been pretty seriously abused in a religious cult as a missionary in the Philippines. And I'm not going to tell her story. I'll probably get it wrong anyway. But she started writing about what religion does to people psychologically and wrote a book called Leaving the Fold, which is a very popular book for people leaving fundamentalist religions. We recommend it at Recover from Religion all the time. I would say almost daily we recommend her book. But after, I think she published it in 1995, about 10 years ago, she decided to say, let's call it what it is, and let's call it religious trauma syndrome, RTS specifically. And she started labeling it. She said, look, you can, in a clinical setting, you can see people displaying symptoms of trauma. And if you just pull the thread and you keep pulling the thread, you almost always get back to religion.
Yep.
On many childhood traumas or many traumas that are related to childhood. Parents beating their children for getting caught masturbating. Okay, why are they upset about that? Because their religion teaches them. Mm-hmm. So if you beat your child for masturbating and you do it for religious reasons, that's going to create trauma around their sexuality. The problem is that therapists are afraid to deal with religion as a source of trauma. It's just our culture does not allow religion. It gives religion a pass on so many things.
Yeah.
Religion gives you a pass for circumcise your kid. Nobody's going to question you as a parent if you circumcise your kid.
Yep.
And, we can name so many other things that religion gets a pass on. Well, it gets a pass here. And what we see is so many children are traumatized by the way they were treated by their parents, by their grandparents, by their, families, their community in religious communities. And now as adults, they're expressing those trauma. They're waking up in the middle of the night with cold sweats around fear of hell.
Yep.
They can't concentrate during the daytime because they feel guilty about masturbating. Any number of things are directly related to their religious abuse. I mean, it is abuse to tell a child they shouldn't masturbate. Well, because biologically that ain't going to happen.
Right.
So you're telling somebody to do something that biologically they have just an incredible drive to do, or any number of other things we could talk about. So Janice Selby, about a year ago, decided, let's put this on the map. And my hat is off to her. She's doing a great job. She decided, let's do a conference on it. And she's invited Dr. Marlene Winnell. She's invited Dr. Valerie Tirico. She's invited me. She's invited half a dozen other experts, if you will, on trauma, on psychology, on religion. And they're having a conference in April. It's called Court 2020. You can just look at court2020.com. And it's called Conference on Religious Trauma 2020. We're creating, and the Secular Therapy Project has signed on to be the primary co-sponsor of this.
Oh,
we think this is right down our alley, perfectly aligned with our mission at the Secular Therapy Project. So, and she's happily brought us on. We're working really closely together. Part of the reason I wanted to talk tonight was to start getting awareness of this conference. It'll be in British Vancouver, and it'll be open to therapists and non-therapists alike. There'll be 2 tracks, one for the lay public and one for therapists. And she is actively working on CEUs so that they will be accredited for CEUs. I don't know if that'll happen. I don't know how much it'll happen. But the fact is, we need to be better at identifying as therapists. We need to be better at identifying trauma and helping understand the roots of that trauma. Because if you ignore it, then it's going to be very difficult to deal with the symptoms or with the root cause.
Yeah.
So that's
CORT, C-O-R-T, not C-O-U-R-T.
No, C-O-R-T 2020.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what it is. And Janice Selby, it's going to have a stellar lineup of speakers. Also, I just noticed she's a good friend of mine and a former board member recovering from religion. Nathan Phelps is going to be there.
Nice.
And I think he'll be even speaking. I don't know if you've ever seen Nathan talk, but wow, he has a powerful talk about the religious abuse that he suffered at the Westboro Baptist Church.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I live just 45 miles from Westboro Baptist Church.
Prime real estate there.
Yeah, seriously.
Nice.
Well, it sounds like a really exciting conference, and definitely want to encourage people to check that out. We'll make sure to include links to that, as well as the books and some of the other resources that we talked about in the footnotes for this episode. Beyond that, any last thoughts, anything else that you would like to say to folks who are kind of just now coming aware of circumcision and some of these other issues?
Well, I do think if you suspect that may be a problem, and if you're not, even if you're not a penis owner, if your partner is a penis owner and they're having problems, I mean, if you're a partner with someone and they're having problems, you probably know it, or there's indications of it.
Sure.
I would ask you to get involved and help them understand. Maybe watch this very podcast so that they get an idea of, that this is not something to ignore, that there is help out there. And V, I think your idea that there are probably medical professionals out there that can help correct a botched circumcision. I mean, there's lots of those kinds of things. I also think you need to talk honestly and about how your feelings about parents who did this to you. They made a decision, and how do you get over that? I don't want people. I know men right now, and I think this is harmful. It's like adding harm to harm, double negatives here. Your parents did the best they could with the knowledge they had.
Mm-hmm.
And to blame them for this, and I think if they knew what we know today, they might not have made that decision.
Yeah.
So learn to have a discussion with your parents. Don't make them feel guilty. Don't try to shame them, but I think you need to be forgiving of yourself and forgiving of them, and then they'll get some help. You can sit around blaming your parents for your bad sex life the rest of your life, or you can go do something about it and see if you can improve your sex life. And oh, by the way, practice. Get out there.
Advice for all of us. Yeah. Well,
get over your fear of masturbating. Get over your fear of your own body.
And I think the moment to get started is right now. Just as we do every week, I guess this is the time to encourage people to go out and get some of that practice, to give themselves a big ol' orgasm, or better yet,
give somebody else one.
What are we doing, man? What are we doing?
No, you're done.